Hello and welcome to North 100, a Canadian Highlander podcast, not a set review podcast. Welcome to another open topic. But first, a reminder that everything we do is brought to you by you with the support over at the Patreon at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. That's 2 points for Serge, 0 for
I didn't say anything.
Remember back in the day when Serge used to thank the Patreon at the beginning of these episodes?
It's a little
Not
weird
even
that
once.
we stopped.
Not even once. My name is Serge. Joining me today, I got a Nelly.
Hey, I'm here too.
We got a Wheeler.
I've got one drink.
Shout out to James on Tech.
I got no drinks.
All right, let's talk about our topic today, the points list. What is it? What's changed? What are our opinions? Let's throw it over to Wheeler.
Hi, Wheeler here. Canadian Highlander counselor, aka one of the 5 people that helps make these decisions that impact the points list of the Canadian Highlander format. We have some pretty huge changes to announce. Chances are by the time this is up, you may have already seen them, but it's good to have a pretty nice little discussion about some of these. Before I actually list off the changes, it's important to provide a little context that when the council makes changes to the format, if a card is being added to the points list or being removed from the points list, we need a unanimous vote of 5-0, because that's obviously the biggest jump that any card can make on the points list. So keep that in mind, because I'm going to rattle off a lot of additions and a couple of subtractions from our points list. So starting off with the cards that have had their points increased. Minsk and Boo Timeless Heroes is going from 0 points to 1 point, added to the points list. Psychic Frog is going from 0 points to 1 point, added to the points list. Reanimate is going from 0 points to 1 point, added to the points list. Urza's Saga is going from 0 points to 1 point, added to the points list.
Half the comments start applauding.
And it's all your bots. White Plume Adventurer is going from 0 points to 1 point, added to the points list. Now, the cards that have had their points decreased. Soul Ring is going from 4 points to 3 points.
Can we get Shivam to play Canadian Highlander?
Worth noting, this was also unanimous. It would not have needed to be unanimous in order for it to move, but considering that this is the council's big push for like a unified, hey, we're here, we're in fear of Moxon, get used to it, or whatever.
Sure.
I don't know. I scrambled for something
out of it.
to rhyme.
Yeah.
Rhyme so hard.
We were unanimous on Soul Ring.
So that everybody knows, to make a points increase or decrease, but not remove or add a new card to the list, can you pass with like 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5?
4 out of 5.
4 out of 5.
4 out of 5 needed.
So you're allowed to have one dissenting voice and still make a change to a card that was on the points list when the meeting started.
And for what it's worth, sometimes if we have a 4-1 split, we will not vote because we want to really figure out what the, we take that.
Like why?
Yeah.
The 4s are willing to hear the one person out, wait until the next session.
That one is a very powerful stance to take, and so we want to listen to them. Sure. There are 2 other cards. Spellseeker has been reduced from 1 point to 0 points and now is free from the points list. And Survival of the Fittest has been decreased from 1 point to 0 points, being removed from the points list. A total of 8 changes, 5 new cards being added, and 2 cards being removed entirely.
Huge.
This is something that has been in the works for, honestly, years, but more accurately, like the past 6 months or so. I'm sure that if you watch the show, you have probably been in the comment section asking about some of these cards and wondering why they haven't been addressed. And that's because there was a very specific philosophy regarding cards on the points list. The points list effectively being reserved for, the nastiest cards to ever walk this plane.
Yeah, it was like fast mana, tutors, combo pieces. It was pretty rare for like a mid-range card to show up on it.
Right. Like the closest thing that we would have received somewhat recently is 4th Aerolingus from the Lord of the Rings Commander product, where it's not a combo card, but it sure as hell feels like it. You combine 4th Aerolingus with some amount of mana, and you get to win the game. And then somewhat recently with Ren and 6 getting pointed, that card's more of a mid-range card, and a lot of the consideration to Ren 6 being added to the points list was because it made mana bases so good and also made it feel terrible to play Mana Dorks. And Mana Dorks didn't need any additional help to feel terrible in a world of Furies and Pyrokinesis and whatnot. But still, more of a mid-range card that had kind of this plausible deniability of like, well, you could strip lock people. That's why it's here. You strip lock them, they can't play the game, that's no fun. But these are, I mean, Minsk and Boo is kind of close to Fourth Aerolingus in that it's a card that just hits the table and kills people.
Yeah.
But it's not as I'm going to play this tutor to find this card to then end the game in a big.
It's harder to
spectacular
tutor for a
fashion.
planeswalker than it is to find a sorcery.
Yeah, Fourth Aerolingus plays a little more like Scape Shift, I guess is what I would say, but a flexible Scape Shift that doesn't require you to add Valakut and all this stuff. What I'm trying to get at is this is a shift in philosophy to try and accommodate for this continued printing of these self-perpetuating value engines that really feed into themselves, right? Like mechanically and through their gameplay, that keep popping up through products that are not printed into standard. So through Commander product, through Modern Horizons product, through stuff like Lord of the Rings or through Baldur's Gate. Basically, they bypass a lot of the safety valves that you would have on a set entering standard. And maybe they're designed for formats like Commander and have mechanics attached to them that are pretty miserable in 1v1.
Yeah.
But cards that, like, Psychic Frog's a really basic example of this in that it draws cards when it hits you. And then you pitch cards to make it bigger and unkillable. And if they play something, if they try to challenge it on the board, you exile cards to give it flying, right?
There goes our discussion on Psychic Frog. No, I'm kidding. So I do have a question on this.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously take a lot of data on like tournament winning lists, not only in Victoria, but other places where they submit it.
Yeah.
How much of the pointed cards were due to like deck homogeneity?
Yeah,
it's like I butchered that word. It's like
decks being the same as each other across a wide variety of decks.
Were we finding they were showing up too much? Is this because of like 4-color good stuff and check pile decks all playing these cards, or
that
like,
is
I'm curious.
That is a part of it for sure, right? We want the format, and Magic the Gathering is more interesting when people are doing different things, when they're looking to achieve different goals, and ideally using different tools to do that. Highlander especially is more interesting when your decisions matter. And one of the best decisions you can make is what one-pointed card are you playing, or what one-pointed cards are you playing in substitution for some of the pillars of the format like Power 9 or big pointed cards. And so there, like that is the homogeneity. No, I screwed it up too.
Right? You get it in your head, you trip over it, right?
Yeah.
Homogenization of the format?
Sure.
This
is in part an effort to combat that, to make players make more decisions in deck building that end up influencing directly their decisions, that end up influencing the texture of gameplay, and how, your average, basically saying like, if we take two Gruul Monsters lists, there could be a list that will play completely differently from another one, depending on whether or not they put their points into fast, colorless mana, plus like a Minsk and Boo, or they put it into Moxen, plus some one-pointers, or they go lower with Strip. Like it really it can lead to, there's bound to be overlap between these decks and the cards they play, but they will play differently. You'll make different decisions, and those decisions will end up creating more unique gameplay scenarios. Really quickly, I want to comment on the data. We do not have the data to make decisions entirely based off that. Magic Online has hundreds of thousands of matches getting played in leagues, and they're able to reap all that data. A lot of what the council does is vibes based.
And to be clear, Wheeler means leagues of formats that aren't Canadian Highlander. There are some MTGO Canadian Highlander leagues, but we don't have all the data.
Thank you for clarifying.
But we can't say like 65%. I mean, we can, but when we say like 65% of these decks have Psychic Frog in them or whatever,
right?
Our data size is not huge.
It's not that big.
Yeah. Okay.
And because we're a format that doesn't have the same, like, we're a community run format. People play garbage all the time. They're not really influenced by, I mean, people play garbage in every format, but we're not influenced by a lot of cash.
No.
We're not influenced by that kind of thing. So people, they just play what they like, and that can lead to, given such a small sample size, it can lead to drawing some incomplete conclusions.
I don't want to throw us off too much from the topic, but there is a fascinating thing with the reach of this format now, which was for a very long time a community format. Right? It was based in Victoria, BC, and it was played by Victoria, BC, and the council was there, and a lot of the decisions were made purely based on our local metagame.
Right.
Yeah.
And the format has grown tremendously, I say, opening myself up to the audience here.
Yes.
And I do wonder how much you think about the global reach of this now when you're making decisions from what is like Victoria tournaments.
Always. Victoria is really no different from the community in Portland to the community in Ireland, or in like Dublin to the Jersey scene or the players in Berlin, whatever, right? Like, each individual community has its own biases. They have their own styles of decks playing. They have their own like preferences towards what decks they deem are the best. There's a lot. So we gotta reach out. Basically. We gotta expand that.
Let me come back to when you said decisions are based on their local meta and this plan of kind of updating the philosophy. So in previous councils,
and Nelly was a previous counselor, just for the audience sake.
So we would often compare a potential new points increase or a card being added to the list or something being reduced to the same points as another card as in terms of like some sort of like equity inside the points list. So like if a Mox Emerald is 3 points, like you need to have 3 like Mox Emeralds worth of something for like Flash to be worth 9 points, for example.
Yeah.
Or 3 of your Psychic Froggers, a Saga White Plume Adventurer would need to sort of be worth a Mox. Like the value of all the cards on the list needed to be somewhat comparable, or like the spreads needed to be equally scary. And I think if you want to like free yourself from that and just add cards to the list based on keeping the format from getting too homogenous, I think that's probably fine and a decent way to address, as you said earlier, cards being introduced to the game that didn't have to go through their time in standard and pass those security valves, right? Because in a way, Wizards is giving us a bunch of cards that could have been from the 90s, in terms of their like wildly powerful abilities, Orcish Bowmasters certainly seems like a card like, well, it probably would have gotten banned in its standard format, or maybe even if it came out in 1998, someone would have been like, wait, really? And +1/+1 counters each time? So I like that, and I think that's like a really important thing to communicate, especially to some of our viewers who've been playing for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Like where the council stands currently on what it takes to make it to be a 1-point card. Like, why is X card 0 and why is X 1? Or what does 1 point mean, etc.
So really quickly, is there anything else we want to set foundationally, like about council philosophy or points changes in general? Or...
No, we're just going to have to do a whole other episode because I'll go way too in depth in it.
Well, then let's start going over each of the cards specifically. Okay. Because I think there's a lot to be gained there. So the first card you mentioned was Minskin Boo.
Yes.
The 4-mana Planeswalker. Now, previously, the only other 4-mana Planeswalker we've ever had pointed, we had Jace the Mind Sculptor pointed at one point in the history of the format. Also was banned for a while in other formats outside of it. Previously banned in Standard and in Modern.
Mm-hmm.
Was it banned in Standard?
Was it banned in Modern?
It was banned in Standard. It was banned in Modern.
Yeah.
Was it banned in Extended? I think it might have been
banned in Extended.
I think it was banned in Extended.
Yeah.
How was Extended back then?
Yes.
And then, as Wheeler said, a product probably not made for 1v1. It literally says can be your commander right on it. A line of text that I didn't even know was printed on that card until very recently.
There's some commander players. This is their favorite commander. For sure.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, this card. Yeah,
I'd like it too if I won all my games.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm on team good riddance on this one, especially when it comes down on turn 3, maybe even turn 2 on a god draw or something like that. Extremely unpleasant, like Elf Mox Ancient Tomb or something like that.
Yeah.
You can kill Questing Beast.
You can't.
When you kill Questing Beast, it's dead.
What was somebody was saying? There is a gotcha against Minsc and Boo, which is specifically the triggered ability with the hamster.
Well, you can lightning bolt Minsc and Boo
Yeah.
with the triggered ability on the stack.
Yeah, there's that small counterplay in there, much like when you got lost my Urza saga with the first loyalty counter.
Yes, yeah.
Like there's windows of time to play against it, but this card is miserable to play against.
Yeah, the reasoning, and for those curious, on the Canlander Discord and the website, there's like a write-up with all why these were all done, and I'll give a self-plug here, and I talked about this already for about 3 hours today.
Oh, sick.
So my mind has only been Canlander today.
Sure, good.
So if you haven't gotten enough, hit up Wheeler's VOD. It's there. It's been less than 2 weeks if you're watching this when this episode came out. He's got a VOD on Twitch.
Minsc and Boo is just the best in the business. It is a power outlier in terms of ways to close the game while also being resilient and flexible, right? Like the play pattern most commonly associated with this card is play this card, make hamster big. And already off of that, you're getting what is effectively 8 mana worth of like card out of 4 mana. And then what you do from there, God forbid if you get to untap with everything, well, you're probably winning the game, but you can win the game in a couple of different ways. So you have these pivot points, these decision trees that if they try to challenge this card on the board, you're going to run into, you can make your thing bigger. Or if they decide to, get rid of the hamster, well, you just got a new one and you could restock. Or if they do play out on the board and it's bigger, you get to just draw 4 cards and dome something for 4, right? This card slices and dices. It does everything. It's just the best at ending games. And I don't think it's particularly close. Like Seasoned Dungeoneer is one of the few other 4 mana like board-based cards that pops up that could be comparable to this. We'll get to that card in a bit. But it also just provided a way to close that was way too efficient for decks that traditionally did not have the ability to close, right? Think back in the day, control decks didn't have pressure, right?
Yes.
It just wasn't a thing. They had
needed to completely shut you down and then untap.
Yeah.
And then gracefully play out some swan of a big creature with Shroud.
If they if they live long enough to wrath you, that's when the control deck could take over.
Yeah. They look to clear up the board, you rebuild, they deal with that, they play a Consecrated Sphinx or an Inferno Titan or whatever. And even more modern kind of top end cards like Teferi 5 or whatever can be used in substitution for there. But that was a choice that they would make when they were selecting their archetype, right? It's like this is a downside of this deck is that I've made this call that my deck is not going to be able to close. That is not a thing that happens nowadays.
And I also, when you're making that call, you also have to choose not to be able to like race a Time Vault player that has Thoughtseize or something.
Yeah.
Like you're making a trade-off.
But now you get that, and that's part of why we've seen this. I'm going to use a homogenized kind of these blue X piles. It's why it's hard to call them control or mid range or tempo, and they're often just called
good stuff.
They're like the color combination.
So, for Minsc and Boo specifically, were red-green decks a problem, or was it just people splashing colors to play Minsc and Boo? Like, where was this popping up with enough frequency that it deserved pointing?
It is a problem in decks like Check Pile. Could be used in like Just Sky Green, Gruul monsters, Naya monsters. Some of these archetypes aren't necessarily problems, but they do highlight a lot of the issues that current design trends and fast mana play into. And Minsc and Boo just happens to be the best of the bunch at doing that.
Sure. Next up, we had Psychic Frog.
Psychic Frog.
Now, you mentioned before this is terrifying because it draws cards and fuels itself because it gets big enough that it gets up there. It shuts down aggressive decks because it just gets so big.
Yeah, it's like Minsc and Boo in that it feeds into itself, except it's a 2-drop, and it's a matchup check. Like, how do you kill this thing?
Lightning Bolt.
Path
no.
to Exile.
Nope.
Oh,
you kill it with Path, Swords, white cards, basically.
Yeah.
And Fatal
I was
Push.
going to say Moat for a second, and then I finished reading the card.
Yeah. So if you are a green deck or a red deck or a blue deck, and if you're a black deck and you draw the wrong half of your busted removal spells, like your snuff out or your cut down or even dismember.
Dismember. God,
right?
dismember would feel bad, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, dismember, that's a lot of cards to pitch, but guess what? It's almost always the right thing to do. Yeah, this card is just a bit of a matchup check, a bit of an awkward one to have in a format without sideboards. Hits the board way too quickly, snowballs, takes over the game. It's just too good at what it does. There's kind of a trend with all these cards in which they're really terrifying when you accelerate into them early on before there's any reasonable counterplay, but they're also terrifying if you draw them on turn 7.
Right.
And then the game is really, so the game is all about Psychic Frog when it's on turn 2. And if it's drawn on turn 7 when the dust is cleared, then the game is now all about Psychic Frog on turn 7. You know, still has some. If it's that late in the game, you probably don't have as many cards in hand or whatever, and so it's not as difficult to kill. But if you don't kill it right then and there, you are losing that game.
Yeah, it shows up and demands all the attention on an even board, for sure, right? Like, there's some situations Psychic Frog can't save you from if you draw it on turn 7 and you're going to die.
Right.
But in the early game, I mean, it's wild. In the Mox's format, you can protect this thing with mana, like on turn 1 with a good draw.
Yeah,
right? That's wild.
Yeah, it is a blue and black card.
Yeah.
It is a blue. We have seen a trend of blue-black getting access to more cards that are better against red, which was always that color combination's weakness.
Yeah.
And now you got Bowmasters, you got Psychic Frog, you got Emperor of Bones, whatever. Your things are too big. Their Barbarian Ring is so sad. And yeah, you could just take over the game until you get your Barrowgoy for your Shieldred. Another big thing to really invalidate the red decks with.
So once again, where was this popping up?
Check pile, Grixis Black, Grixis itself. There are some blue-black shells. It's just there. I want to be clear that while there are cards that we will point because they are targeting specific archetypes, a part of this is also just saying like, hey, it's messed up when one of the best decks in the format has this on turn 2.
Sure.
But it's also messed up when somebody with their mid-range Esper Brew has this on turn 2.
Right. Okay.
Right? Like, there are more targeted targeted pointings, and some cards are definitely pointed with specific archetypes in mind. But because so many of these cards are just generic good stuff, take over the game, make the game about themselves, low counterplay cards, like, the problem is that I can't tell you one specific thing.
That's fair. That's fair.
I was playing this thing in Grixis Artifacts.
Yeah.
I was thinking about playing this card in Storm, which is like,
just because you're like, what if I have this in my opening hand? Then I'll just play this game instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, you just made me think of the old days before the council matured, and we had a local player named Tim Mack, the Goblin King, who we couldn't beat him with goblins. We're like, he's got 0 points in his deck. Yeah. We need to point something. Yeah. And we're like, no, you just need to play Pyroclasm. But I like that we've come a little bit further than that. That it's not targeted to a deck or problem person or anything like that. It's targeted to the power level.
Yeah. Sometimes it can target a deck.
That's fair.
But this one is, I mean, it does kind of target a deck that we are about to talk about with the next card too.
I was going to say the next card is Reanimate.
Yes.
And this one is wild to me. I have 2 cards that I was legitimately shocked about. And Reanimate appearing on the points list now was big to me because my first thought is I didn't think Reanimator was a problem. Right? Like combo Reanimator, but I imagine that's not the issue. This probably isn't hitting your Grizzlebrands or your OG Shieldrids or your Ionas or even, I mean, those are even like the targets that people hit anymore.
Sometimes.
So, I guess, yeah. So why is Reanimate pointed?
Well, that's the issue, is that it's doing that and it's also doing everything else. Yeah, my write-up started with saying, like, back in the day, Reanimate was just the best card to use when you're looking to bring back a gigantic threat to take over the game that created an insurmountable card advantage or board presence for low cost, at the cost of losing a bunch of life because your thing was gigantic.
Yeah, Inkwell Leviathan, Blazing Archon, all those OGs, right?
It still does that, but those are now the best they've ever been with Atraxa and Archon of Cruelty and that style card. But it also brings back a game-ending threat that costs 3 mana. Like the cards that end the game,
or 2, like the one we just saw. Yeah,
like how hard is it to deal with a Barrowgoyf or a Psychic Frog or a Nadu or a White Plume Adventurer, just any of these cards where you come out being like even slightly happy, right? And then what if you had to do it again because your opponent had a 1-mana spell that they could have also had if they were combo killing you with big idiots, or combo killing you with small idiots in like a creature combo strategy, or maybe they thought your card looked great. They dealt with your card and they took it.
Right, I forgot about the flexibility of Reanimate being able to hit any graveyard.
Yeah. Reanimator as an archetype has always been top tier and always kind of like secret broken. Like its worst matchup is itself. Or like it doesn't have bad.
Sometimes they have the scoos.
Well,
with all the mana,
sorry, it doesn't have bad matchups against archetypes. It has bad matchups against cards.
It just has to beat specific cards.
Dodge, Line Sash, Scavenging Ooze, because nobody plays Rust in Peace
Rust in Peace in Canadian Highlander. Like I said that card's name to like acknowledge. But it's like no one plays.
Like Endurance is the one that you're because that's the free one. But
I'm glad you brought up pitch elementals.
Yes,
because I think that's another important part of why Reanimate deserves a point.
Right.
For me, this is the most interesting change on the list because look, it's got a Tempest expansion symbol and it's going up in points, right? Like that. The rest of the cards that are going up are all pretty new. Like the oldest one is MH2 or something, Urza Saga, right? Like it's just getting a point today, but this one's from before most of you were born, and it's going up because of the way these other cards have come out and affected deck building. And when I was talking earlier about how the points changes kind of had to make sense, if you look closely, this card is a Mox, or at least a Dark Ritual, right? Like you're spending 1 mana and you're getting 3 to 9 mana's worth of creature at the cost of life, but those points of life to mana don't equate evenly, right? Like you pay 3 life to win the game every time. So, I see this card and I think it's like it's a pretty mature, sort of hard to guess unless you've been playing a lot of Canadian Highlander. But I look at a bunch of my lists from recently, and we'll get into that later. But a lot of my decks from last year are like, well, I got to cut Reanimate because I'm just like playing it in every spot that I have a swamp because it's just so good all the time.
It is also this is a shift in points, kind of a nod towards like Nadu and Seeker Walk stuff, because Spellseeker had its points reduced. And Nadu is a card that's on everybody's mind, right? And is a card we'll probably talk about a little at the end. But this is a way of saying like, well, these creature combo decks, they've kind of, it's weird. They've been getting so good and so streamlined, and they've been doing it alongside Fury and Pyrokinesis and all these cards. So it feels like they're in a rough spot. And some of them are, right? Genuinely, they're in a rough spot in that the gameplay gets shut down. But when it doesn't get shut down, it's more streamlined than it's ever been. Right. And in part because of cards like Reanimate. Just giving you more options, more insurance, basically, into your play pattern, or until you're in more insurance for your game plan to, if it goes a little wonky, to then recover immediately and keep going. Or even just certain loops involve putting cards in the graveyard to then reanimate with this. So it is a nod that like, hey, some of these Nadu decks as well are going to be playing Reanimate. Some of these Seeker Walk decks, Seeker Walk has gotten a couple of new points here. Maybe we want to shift where those points are going to be.
So that deck's not super free. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Next up was White Plume Adventurer.
Urza's Saga.
Pardon me. The two big ones. Urza's Saga. So, man, where to even start on this one? So I guess some background. If you look through the 2 years-ish of North 100 Showdown recordings we've had, there's been 3 things that people complain about the most in the comments. Urza's Saga is one of those, and the next card after this, White Plume, is the Initiative, is one of the other ones.
Yeah.
So this is fascinating, and this one feels like it was a long time coming, like a long, long time coming.
Yeah, as in terms of power level, Urza Saga could have easily been a 1-point card within like the first couple of months of printing.
Yeah, Highlander players didn't miss this or anything.
Yeah,
Yes.
no.
Yeah.
We've been playing it.
This card finds Black Lotus and Moxen. Like we were on top of it. The thing is, it does actually do some good for the format. One, it has allowed artifact decks to kind of have a mid-range role, or it's a card that reinforces more of a mid-range role for these like artifact Urza Lord High Artificer play to the board style decks, which is cool. That's a thing that we hadn't really seen before, and now we get to see those decks kind of pop up. It's very good against the blue decks. Urza Saga is a great way of getting underneath like a check pile list or a Jeskai list, because you can't counter this, bozo.
And hey, for those of you listening, very good against the blue decks in this context is something we like.
Yes. Yeah, you want something to help fight the Ancestral Recall decks, especially a card that isn't a dedicated combo card, right? Because one of the best ways to beat those decks was cast Silence, kill them.
Right.
And you didn't have to do that with this card. You would do that with this card, but you didn't have to, which is important. And then lastly, and I think a reason why there was a lot of chatter about this is that this card is really good at letting people win even after they've mulliganed. And there is a mindset that is ever present in Magic players with a competitive edge, which is, well, my opponent mulliganed to 5, they deserve to lose. And and this card was a really good equalizer.
That's a little sad. I don't know that I feel that way. Maybe I do when I'm sitting
You
across
do.
from the mulligan.
You
5
100% do.
You're like, oh, they mulled to 5? Easy win. I got this.
Hey.
It's not something you feel when you're not playing Magic, but then when your opponent mulls to 5, you're like, okay, now
I'm willing to admit, I feel that way.
I'm going to feel bad if I lose.
You have definitely felt that. It's like, it's good on a mulligan, right? Which feels terrible because it just accrues so much advantage. And also, if it's a kind of card that can also brick a lot of cards your opponents may have. So it kind of makes for an equalizer.
Right, you don't have to worry about playing around the early disruption if you just play Urza Saga and slow roll it, like lets you sort of earn back.
It's a fabricate that you don't have to cast, or what's the one that put? It's like a tinker, only for a 1 or a 0 that you don't have to cast, right? So gets through all those blue things, obviously.
Those are good things, but also as time went on and as more just really powerful board-based cards got printed, as we got more targets beyond Moxen / Lotus, like obviously we had Shadow Spear and Skull Clamp, but now getting like Lava Spur Boots, Shuko, even stuff like Ghost Vacuum, right? Like it is Haywire Might. A bunch of cards have just made this card, a bunch of new printings have made this card just so incredibly good.
Just too flexible.
It's too flexible. It's too powerful at what it does for such a low. It's a land. You just put it in your deck. It casts spells.
I want to point out too, like Wheeler listed all these reasons why this card is good and why people liked it, and didn't really miss any archetypes. So like everyone, so to catch you up, if you're, because I know a lot of our listeners don't really play; they just like listening to us or whatever, or they're like catching up from time to time. Like this card has just been in every deck.
Yeah.
Very few decks were not playing this card over the last 2 years, and so that's one of the reasons to kind of say to the council, like, well, you don't have to point it because everyone's getting approximately equal advantage out of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
That's not great.
But go on. You started to see it more and more everywhere all the time.
You just see it everywhere all the time. It's getting better. The counterplay is not catching up to it. Like you get March of the Otherworldly Light and you're like, oh, hell yeah. And then you're like, oh, that's one card out of 100.
Right.
And it basically got to a point where, hey, this does too much. It's way too good. It's gotten even better in combo shells as like Time Vault has gotten more fleshed out recently, in the past couple of years, and Nadu popping up and Citadel Storm and whatever. Like it's Urza's Saga, It's a card that is so busted, and it just now enough time has gone by. Like the council tries to be very deliberate with their pointing, right? And enough time has gone by.
So we maybe wait to see, like, if everyone's getting equal value of it, maybe we leave it like it's a wasteland.
That could be a good thing.
It could be fine, but we left enough time. The council felt like, okay, no, we've seen enough. It's actually kind of dominating games, and this is getting sort of boring.
Yeah.
Right?
It was Snorlax in GSC competitive play.
Hey, shout out to whoever just got that reference. They're not
but
at
worse.
work with Wheeler right now.
All right, White Plume Adventure and the initiative. So this is number 2 of the most commented things in the North 100 Showdown. You know, Urza's Saga, the initiative. The games are so boring. It's always about fighting over the initiative. It's always the same thing. Yada 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 yada. So I guess I have 2 questions here.
Okay.
Or maybe it's this 2 questions on the same 2 sides of the same coin question. Is this a targeted ban against the initiative, or White Plume Adventure, or both? Right? Like,
so there is a reason why it is White Plume Adventurer. The initiative, when introduced very quickly, is the part of it that players take the most umbrage with, right? Like, we have seen the initiative as a mechanic and as a dedicated archetype, like 3-color, 4-color initiative decks have kind of mellowed out, right? New Toy Syndrome's worn off. We've mellowed out on these cards as like a be-all, end-all. This is what the format's all about now.
All these other 4-mana adventure cards or initiative cards aren't as hot.
Yeah. They're
okay.
They're good. They're very good, but they're like, it's not, the format isn't just about the initiative. Sometimes when it shows up, and it just show up frequently, then it can make games about the initiative. But at the same time, the game still goes on a little bit, right? There's room for play with some of these cards. You could make a philosophical argument for the format that there are other initiative cards that need to be pointed. Like, you could, I'm not saying we're doing it, not saying it's one I would personally want to do, but you could say, well, the initiative is too good and too consistent, so we're going to hit CZDZ, Caves of Chaos, and Undermountain Adventurer.
sure.
That's not what we did.
The 3 good 4-mana ones
Yes.
as well, right?
We instead went for the power outlier in terms of speed, because the biggest issue with the initiative is when it comes down and there's no counterplay. And being a 3-drop means that, well, Moxen, Mana Crypt, Ring, the Chrome Mox, Mana Dork, whatever, this getting introduced, like, if this is introduced on turn 2 and I'm on the draw, it's over.
Well, yeah.
Right?
So the play pattern here is because White Plume basically has vigilance.
Yeah.
It can attack. It's very hard to attack through unless they have a removal spell, and then it becomes a 5/5 the turn after.
Yeah.
It's a giant aggressive vigilance wall that you need to, even if you deal with it, if you don't have a creature advantage, you can't take the initiative back. So they are up life. They're up at least a couple of cards, because they're up the card they used to remove it. They're up the basic land they got, and they're probably drawing a card before you can take it from them afterwards too, right?
If you've ever gone turn 1 birds, turn 2 White Plume, untap birds, bolt their creature they try to play to build to the board, like it's just over.
Yeah.
And so trying to say, like, you're not going to get a free rolled initiative card that is this cheap, right? Again, power outliner. Outlier.
You're good.
I've
You're
been
good.
talking about this for 6 hours.
And you want some Highlander
Power
fish sticks. Sponsor us.
Outlier plus way too quick plus this self-perpetuating engine of the initiative onto this thing makes it huge. Like, going into the forge, into the trap with this thing is just, it's oppressive, right? And so while some may argue that Seasoned Dungeoneer is a stronger card, like pound for pound, that card can just end the game by itself. You can't build the board to like try and deal with it. You really can't race it, and it has card advantage, all that. It is 4 mana, which is at least 1 more mana than 3, and not what we're looking to.
Consistently, it'll be a turn later. Like, it just has to be.
Yeah, I mean, they can still have the nuts and get you, but you know what? That'll just happen. That's the format that we play.
That is why we're playing,
And so, yeah, it's a consideration to like, hey, we're not going to let people free roll doing this at such an accelerated rate. They have to make other changes to their decks to either accommodate White Plume, or they're just going to say, well, I'm not on White Plume anymore. I'm going to play the 4 mana ones. And this does impact some like pretty well performing decks. Like, we've seen a huge boost of White X creature decks like Thalia decks or whatever over the past since Modern Horizons 3, oddly enough.
Right.
Because they're really good at just shutting down things, and you can Swords to Plowshares a Psychic Frog. Like that's a large portion of that.
And they're not drawing a million cards for Bowmasters usually.
Yeah, and like White Plume does show up in Jeskai lists here and there, but it isn't like a staple. So this is when people kind of looked at this and they're like, well, it's not being played in Check Pile. It's not being played in every Jeskai list. Like, what's the deal? And it's like, well, we are, it's just because it's not everywhere doesn't mean it is not still a problem.
So you're saying the reception to this one is a little bit more lukewarm compared to some of the other ones?
I wouldn't say lukewarm, but the reception to this one is a little misguided because there are players that understandably are going to gravitate towards how does this impact the best deck in the format?
Right, which is a question I'd asked sort of at the beginning, right? Yeah.
But we're not all you don't always play the best deck in the format. Right. You end up playing so many different decks. There are so many different experiences that you can have in this format. Doesn't matter if you're against somebody's green-white little kid or the best Jeskai build in the world. If they get a quick White Plume adventurer,
you lose.
It is not good gameplay. It is not healthy gameplay.
They don't necessarily need to have other great cards.
Yeah. My last thing on this, and this was music to my ears, as I talked to Jack, the Canadian Highlander year-end champion on Death and Taxes from a couple of years ago, about these changes. And I mentioned there's a Saga and White Plume, and he goes, "Well, guess I'm cutting Mox," and that's all I want. That's all you want to hear.
Because he'd rather play those two. Okay.
Yeah, he's just like, I'll cut Mox Pearl, I'll play this Saga and Strip, and those are my 3 points. And he's like, yep, that's the equivalency of a Mox for me. And it's like, great, that's what we want to do because you're making that decision. You know what you're talking about, and there may be somebody else who knows what they're talking about that is going to say, no, I'm good on White Plume.
Right.
I'd rather just have Mox.
Right.
And that's what we want. We want the players to make decisions.
Cool.
Yeah.
So now we're at points decreases, and the first one we have is Sol Ring. Now, Sol Ring previously 4 points, bringing it down to 3 points. This brings it in line with Moxen, which is fascinating. And with it being as cheap as it is now, you have to make an interesting decision between. So normally, if you wanted to go fast, you had like Mox, Ancient Tomb, Mana Crypt, Sol Ring, were sort of your ideas of if a 2-color deck, what's your balance between those? And I mean, Ancient Tomb was free until maybe 1 or 2 points changes ago.
Ancient Tomb just hit the list in 2024.
Yeah. So that's fairly recent. So Sol Ring cheaper.
Yeah. This is kind of throwing a bone to 2-color decks.
Yep.
This is throwing a bone to monocolor decks, as well as it's a fan favorite card. People like playing Sol Ring. People like thinking of decks that they can build that takes advantage of Sol Ring. Sol Ring is a great card for people looking to flesh out their points list as well. It's kind of the good, I got some points left over.
Yeah.
What am I going to play?
Yep.
But because you're playing that, you may make additional changes to your deck that'll better benefit from having access to a card like Sol Ring.
Nobody wants to include a Sol Ring in a Canadian Highlander deck and not have a bunch of different wild turn ones.
Yes,
so
exactly.
You'll make choices so that your
For
Sol
sure.
Ring is live the turn you cast it.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, we're not trying to get rid of 4-color decks or 3-color decks or anything like that. We're trying to just give more options towards people building 2-color decks or monocolor decks. And this is one that I was more hesitant on than the others.
Feels scary, right?
Yeah, exactly. I've always been a little nervous about fast mana.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like this, especially because of the Mana Crypt and Ancient Tomb changes.
Sure, yeah.
I think that this is in the best place it's ever been just because you can't have it all. Right?
Yeah.
And then if you're thinking about what is your 2-mana accelerator, right? City of Traders, Ancient Tomb, Sol Ring, Mana Crypt, or 3-mana rocks or something like that. Right? There's very few things that tap and add 2 that accelerate you quickly, like in those early explosive turns.
Yeah.
And Sol Ring at 4, I don't think I was playing.
Yeah, it's a people pleaser.
I'm like a little nervous about this one too.
Yeah.
I'll say it. Like I think metagame dependent. This decision's great right now. It's exciting and healthy, and we're going to probably see some number of people jump onto a ship that can play Sol Ring, and hopefully there'll be some brewers trying to do something more busted than good stuff 3 or 4 color situation. But the fact is, all of the kind of best decks in the format right now are not interested in this change. They don't care. It doesn't affect them. They're still going to keep playing their Moxes or their tutors or whatever, right? Mostly their Moxes. So for me, this change is exciting. I will be unmiffed if there is a future where the council said, "Hey, Sol Ring needs to go back up to 4."
Yeah, I mean that.
Replace Mana Crypt with Sol Ring Strip Mine. Beautiful.
I mean, this is Wait, Crypt is 5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Strip is 1.
Oh yeah, you got
Strip is
another one.
only
And
one
Ancient
now?
Tomb.
1, yeah.
And Ancient
You didn't
Tomb.
catch that one? That was
my
the same
God.
time. I think it was the same points.
Yeah. No,
change.
I know it now. Sorry. I just
There's
yeah.
been a lot of shakeup
there
in the
has
last
been,
12 months. Like the council has been working hard.
We have been active.
Active council.
Yeah, it I had a thought and then I lost it. Yeah, Sol Ring's just a fun card.
Sure.
It's cool. Oh, the nice thing about being a Canadian Highlander counselor is that we're not our decisions are not dictated by capitalism. We can make changes and walk them back without having to feel like people just lost a whole bunch of money. And that because of that, we are willing to try these things,
Sure.
right? Sol Ring is, in a way, tied to Moxen. Moxen are tied to cheap one-pointers. Basically, three-pointers are so intrinsically tied to your one-pointers because you get to say, I'm going to play 3 of these things. I'm going to juice my chance of seeing one of these in my 7 or 6 card hand to 26% or whatever.
Right.
And then I'm just going to play something busted. And yeah, if that ends up being too much, then we revert it. It's Sol Ring, right? It's a thing where you can say, hey, we put Sol Ring from 4 to 3 because, it's Sol Ring. Or we go, Sol Ring went back up to 4 because, it's Sol Ring.
Paradox Academy won 2 tournaments in a row.
Yeah.
All right,
We're tired of that
Sol Ring
shit.
to 4.
There
Yeah,
are a lot
yeah.
of universes where you see Sol Ring at 3 and then the metagame is just not your favorite anymore.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we're in one yet. So exciting stuff.
Sage is a hell of a drug.
It's interesting that the two of you were worried about Sol Ring because the next change is one of the ones that shocked me, which was Spellseeker to 0. This one was weird to me because this card I find scary just because of what it can find. It's so flexible, and the play pattern of Spellseeker into Ephemerate into anything.
Yeah.
I mean, and Seeker Walk, for example, being a very powerful archetype.
Yeah, think of this more as a shift along the lines of Merchant Scroll going to 0 as
Rotation going to 0.
Ancestral Recall went up.
Right,
Whereas Fourth Aerlingus was pointed, right? Spellseeker is pretty, when it's good, it's really good.
Yeah.
But it's a weird card in that it's not actually that great on curve. Because if
Right.
you play it on curve, then it can get mucked.
Yeah,
and then you're like,
3 mana 1/1 that just dies.
Yes,
Right. Yeah.
it's actually pretty good later on, which is kind of what we're wanting to do. We want people to have cards that are pretty good on turn 6 and beyond. It's a card that is pretty good in Reanimator. And so but Reanimator just got a tag with the actual card Reanimate. It's pretty good in these Seeker Walk. I mean, it's literally the namesake. Seeker Walk decks or Nadu decks.
But again,
Which
those
just
Seeker,
got-
those Seeker Walk decks, it's better late. You don't usually just try to turn 1 Land or Elf, turn 2 Spellseeker for Time Walk. I mean, you can, obviously, that's fine. But that's just not what the play pattern usually looks like.
And those decks got hit by Saga and Reanimate.
Yep.
And it's kind of throwing a bone to the Boogeyman combo decks of Thoracle and Flash Hulk.
Okay.
It's tough to make adjustments to those without them becoming busted.
Right.
But the 3 mana sorcery speed cards on the table one feels like a more comfortable option to target.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, Seeker Walk is just not actually doing anything. Again, we don't always look to results entirely, but it's just not a deck that has really showed up and had much success in the past couple of years.
I played with it a bunch this summer. It was one of my decks that I looked at how it was being affected by these, and I put a bunch of games in with 4-color Seeker Walk, Nadu Initiative, or in different formations. And it's this just is. I don't know. It's not as good as playing White Bloom Adventure.
I've been chatting with Rachel Weeks about Seeker Walk Recurring Nightmare decks.
Okay.
And this change and the next change are two things I'm I might have to put this together. And maybe we could.
Yeah.
Rachel was literally in my stream yes,
Yeah,
survival
yeah,
of the fittest,
So
Rex
the
shirt,
next
birthday
change is, of
pod.
course, survival of the fittest is free. And this is huge because, I mean, back in the old day, and this is probably because of old Kiki pod lists, Birthing Pod was pointed for a very long time. Survival of the Fittest has been pointed basically as long as I've been playing Highlander.
It's one of the oldest standing cards on the points
this
list.
has been pointed for 14 years or something.
Was it on the 14?
It was since creation. It's been on our
like
points
this
list.
this is a big change.
Yeah.
This going down to 0 and just
it has my favorite explanation for the pointing too, or at least from my point of view.
It's just bad now.
Well, no, it's a very powerful card, diminished by 100 card singleton, and diminished by free removal, being able to interrupt these creature combos and all that. But Survival's been around since forever. It's a cool card for people to play with.
Yes, it is.
And we noticed going as far back as like a decade now, people were not playing with Survival. And so Survival went down to 1. And it's like, great, now you're playing with Survival. And then nobody was playing with Survival. It's like, okay, well, Natural Order is now cheaper. So now you can fit Survival. And they weren't doing it. Okay, Crop Rotation's free, so you can find your Cradle so you can now play Survival. They weren't doing it. Seeker went down. Play your damn Survival. Birthing Pod's free. They're not playing Survival. So every change we made that ended up benefiting creature combo, they're just like, I'm not going to play the Survival. I'll go 9 points. Or they'll rock 10 and they'll begrudgingly like play it. Or just go like, I'll just play Moxen instead. Like I'll take a different approach. And now it's like, fine, have your damn Survival of the Fittest.
Incredible.
Again, like Spellseeker, there is some, worry that this card can do, even though the card itself is not at the power level of a lot of the other things that we are seeing, or especially some of the cards that have been freshly pointed. It is a card where you can construct a metagame or a format where you're like, oh, this isn't that good. Like, this is not healthy. But in cases like that, we have other cards that we can draw attention to, because ultimately we don't think it's Survival's fault.
Sure.
It's probably Nadu or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
I'm going to try to get in early on the called it board here with, if we end up in a scenario where Survival of the Fittest down to 0, turns out it was a problem after all, and like Pod or, some sort of Protean Hulk podless deck is dominating the format, like that, at least it probably took a lot more time than the Soul Ring format did to get to where like multiple people are playing this same deck and like Survival's a problem. I could see it, sure, but it's further in the future, and a ton more work would have gone into crafting those decks.
And even if it is that is probably not Survival's fault.
Sure, it's probably not Survival's
fault. It is, and that's a part of this philosophical
Unlike Soul
change.
Ring. Soul Ring, it would be Soul Ring's fault.
It's always Soul Ring's fault.
Yeah.
All right, we went a little bit longer than I assumed, but I do want to talk about probably 2 cards that I think people are going to ask about, that why didn't get pointed. So I mentioned earlier, there's 3 cards that always show up in the comments. Urza's Saga, the Initiative, the last one is Caracas. Was there any discussion to point Caracas? Now, I don't think any of us would vote for it, but I think it might be good for the benefit of the audience, just because so many people ask about that card.
So there was no discussion for this involving Caracas. The council has discussed Caracas in the past and for previous announcements. And it's something that we actively discuss a lot with community members, especially those that are like winning tournaments and taking down events and whatnot. This is a little snide, but pointing Caracas isn't going to make Brimaz playable, because that's realistically what people want, right? They want I'm not
If only we could go to a simpler time when my friend didn't have a Caracas yet.
It's legitimately Brimaz. If Brimaz didn't exist, people would shut up about Caracas.
Fascinating.
But Caracas is actually a good thing.
I think it's good that we have free answers.
Yeah, imagine dealing with Tameo, Ragavan, dealing with Boo tokens, Atraxa, without access to Caracas. That sounds miserable.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty bad.
Force of Will was at one point on the points list, and it had to do with trying to tax combo decks in a way that felt right. But Caracas doesn't really have any of that like second evil side going for it. It's just an extremely efficient removal spell. So like if you're playing, your Inti and your Lelia out and you had to like sacrifice your lands to do it or whatever, or you like Lotused out your Lelia and then they Caracas you, sure. Now they're ahead on mana. They were extremely efficient in their removal. But still, you're the bad guy combo player in that scenario. Like Caracas is always just saying like, hey, stop playing these legendary creatures that are too good.
Yeah, not to mention, Legends still see a lot of play.
So much play.
Every deck basically has one or two legendary creatures.
Yep.
Without Krakus, they'd probably have more. But those creatures might not even show up just on power level.
Like what?
Right?
What Canadian Highlander players need more than a point on Caracas is to just put a copy of Caracas like as their playmat when they're deck building. Just remember that Caracas exists when you go to build your deck and think, would I still want to cast this 4-drop legend with no ETB if my opponent had Caracas? I'm speaking mostly to myself at this point.
That's fair.
But,
I think I'd rather play in a format with Caracas than Mazavith.
well, Mazavith is legal too.
I know,
No
but
points.
but nobody plays it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? Like Maze just doesn't do it because it's too much of an inclusion cost because it slows you down for mana.
For sure.
Yada, yada, yada. The second one, I'm going to make a called shot here, and I'm going to say the second most asked about card is going to be the One Ring. And that's going to be the last one that I'm going to volunteer. Where was the One Ring discussion about this? Like, we don't need to talk about Nadu or Comet or, like, there's a lot of busted cards in our format, but I bet you the One Ring is going to be the next one.
This card got a boost. It's 1 point cheaper to play One Ring now in your Soul Ring deck.
In your Soul Ring deck. One Ring didn't get talked about at huge length for this announcement. Nadu did, like you mentioned.
Sure.
I brought up Force of Will very briefly.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah,
back.
not like at a level where it was worth commenting on.
Sure,
but
sure.
you know, it deals with Jessica, it deals with check pile.
Okay.
You know, it's Force of Will. And Balance. That's the other one. That gets
Balance
thrown.
back? Really?
Yeah. None of these were voted on.
Sure,
They
sure,
were just brought up in the discussion either between the council or between or from like the Discord panel.
Sure.
The One Ring, I personally think it's actually fine. Like
in our format, singleton.
Yeah, it's
Would
just
you rather your opponent had a One Ring or a Minsk and Boo?
One Ring.
One Ring.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the One Ring is fine. I think without multiples, it's a lot more reasonable. Without 100 card singleton, it's a lot more reasonable. And I think what it does is actually good for the format. I think I like what the One Ring does in terms of giving certain decks a room to breathe and giving like combo strategies like an option to now build around another card for their combo. Like Paradox Engine decks can go all in on like, well, I'm finding the One Ring and I'm comboing off of the One Ring. Or non-Paradox combo decks using the One Ring to just like find interaction to then try and combo kill, and doing so at the cost of their life total, which is arguably the most precious resource for a combo deck. So yeah, it's at this point in time, I am okay with the One Ring being free in Canadian Highlander. I'm open to changing that, but right now I'm cool. It's not really a card on my list for an immediate change. The other cards, like Nadu in particular, is the one where I'm like, yeah, we might have to do something to this card down the line. Like that's or Soul Ring. Those are the two big ones that are more realistic for me. But yeah.
I've learned that we should do non-set reviews more often because we obviously have a lot to talk about.
Aren't they fun?
We bookended the year with them, so you know at least we're on the table or on the board for both the last 2 calendar years.
Heck yeah! I want to say very quickly, thank you, the both of you, for your transparency as a formal council member and a current one. I know some people in positions like that don't feel comfortable sharing, because it makes you vulnerable to talk about the processes, the financial implications of Magic, especially in the wake of what happened in Commander. You're like, this is kind of spooky. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, we all collectively had a nightmare, and it's great. Friends, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this insightful. Maybe if we get a chance, I do want to manage expectations. If we get a chance to do stuff in the future again, we did do 2 episodes back to back. We don't have a schedule to regularly talk about stuff again, but who knows? This has been fun. Maybe we can do more of it. We'll put it like that. That is us managing your expectations. A reminder that everything we do is brought to you by you with your support of the Patreon over at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. I've been Serge, joined by Nelly.
I wish you had thanked the Patreon supporters though.
One of these days I'll remember. We got a Wheeler.
I kind of just want Comet banned, not points.
Yeah.
Shout out to James on Tech.
I have 6 drinks now.
Oh my God.
Oh, he's got a whole 6-pack.
He's ramping. That's Sol Ring right there.
Oh, God.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.